Welcome back to another jaw-dropping tale of property warfare that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about homeowner associations and property rights. Today's story involves a sneaky real estate scheme, a family cabin with dark secrets, and a showdown that nobody saw coming. Trust me when I say the ending will leave you speechless. Imagine inheriting your grandfather's beloved mountain cabin, only to discover that a group of scheming neighbors has been plotting to steal it right from under your nose. They thought they had the perfect plan: forge some documents, manipulate the legal system, and cash in on prime mountain real estate. But what they didn't count on was dealing with someone who fights dirty when cornered. This is the story of how I turned the tables on a real estate conspiracy that almost cost me everything. Let me introduce you to the players in this unbelievable drama. First, there's Sarah Mitchell, a 29-year-old graphic designer from Denver who had always been close to her grandfather. When Harold Mitchell passed away at 87, he left Sarah his most prized possession, a rustic cabin nestled in the Colorado Rockies near Aspen. Sarah had spent countless childhood summers at that cabin, learning to fish in the crystal-clear stream that ran behind it and helping her grandfather maintain the property he'd built with his own hands in 1978. Then we have Vincent Rothschild, a 52-year-old real estate developer with a reputation for aggressive tactics and questionable ethics. Vincent owned several properties in the area and had been eyeing Harold's cabin for years, knowing its value would skyrocket as Aspen real estate continued to boom. He was the type of man who saw dollar signs where others saw sentimental value, and he had no qualms about bending rules to get what he wanted. Margaret Chen, Vincent's business partner and a 45-year-old former paralegal, brought the legal expertise to their schemes. Margaret had been disbarred 3 years earlier for ethics violations but still knew enough about property law to craft convincing documents. She specialized in finding loopholes and creating paper trails that could fool casual observers. There's also Detective Ray Holbrook, a 38-year-old Colorado State Police investigator who specialized in real estate fraud. Ray had been tracking Vincent's questionable deals for months but hadn't been able to build a solid case until Sarah's situation landed on his desk. Finally, we have David Kim, a sharp property attorney who specialized in inheritance disputes and real estate fraud. David had built his practice defending families against exactly the kind of predatory behavior that Vincent and Margaret represented. Sarah's troubles began 3 months after her grandfather's funeral. She'd been visiting the cabin regularly, both to grieve and to decide what to do with the property. The cabin was beautiful but needed work. New plumbing, electrical updates, and general maintenance that Harold hadn't been able to handle in his final years. The cabin sat on 5 acres of pristine mountain land, surrounded by aspen groves and overlooking a valley that seemed untouched by time. Harold had chosen the location carefully, buying the land when it was still affordable and building the cabin himself over 2 summers. The property had no HOA, no covenants, and no restrictions. Just pure mountain freedom. Sarah loved the place but wasn't sure she could afford the upkeep on her graphic designer salary. She'd been considering either selling the cabin or renting it out to help cover expenses when she received a letter that changed everything. The letter, sent via certified mail, claimed to be from something called the Alpine Valley Property Management Association. It stated that Harold's estate owed $47,000 in unpaid fees, assessments, and penalties dating back 5 years. The letter demanded immediate payment and threatened foreclosure if the debt wasn't settled within 30 days. Sarah was stunned. Her grandfather had never mentioned any property association, and she'd never seen any bills or notices about such fees. Harold had been meticulous about his finances, keeping detailed records of every expense related to the cabin. Sarah had reviewed all his papers after his death and found no evidence of any association membership or fee obligations. Confused and worried, Sarah called the phone number on the letter. A professional-sounding woman answered. Alpine Valley Property Management, Margaret speaking. Hi, I received a letter about my grandfather's cabin, but I think there's been some mistake. He never mentioned being part of any property association. Margaret's voice was sympathetic but firm. I'm sorry for your loss, dear. Unfortunately, property associations often run in the background without owners being fully aware of their obligations. Your grandfather's cabin has been subject to our management agreement since 2018, and the fees have been accumulating. Sarah felt her heart sink. But I've never seen any bills or correspondence about this. We sent numerous notices to the property address, but they may have been overlooked. Elderly property owners sometimes miss important mail. Regardless, the debt exists and must be satisfied. The call left Sarah feeling overwhelmed and uncertain. She spent the next week researching property records and trying to understand how her grandfather could have accumulated such a massive debt without her knowledge. What Sarah didn't know was that she'd stumbled into an elaborate real estate scam that Vincent and Margaret had been perfecting for years. Their scheme targeted inherited mountain properties, especially those owned by elderly people who might not be closely monitoring their affairs. The Alpine Valley Property Management Association existed only on paper, a shell organization that Vincent and Margaret used to create fake fee obligations against desirable properties. They would file fraudulent liens claiming unpaid association fees, then either force sales to recover their debts or offer to help distressed owners by purchasing properties at below-market prices. Vincent had been watching Harold's cabin for 3 years, waiting for the right opportunity to make his move. When Harold's obituary appeared in the local paper, Vincent knew his chance had come. Within weeks, Margaret had filed the fraudulent lien and sent the demand letter to Sarah. Their plan was simple but effective. Overwhelm the heir with confusing legal documents and impossible financial demands, then swoop in with an offer to solve the problem by purchasing the property for a fraction of its worth. They'd already used this strategy successfully on 4 other mountain properties, netting over $2 million in illegal profits. Margaret had become expert at creating convincing documentation. She knew exactly which forms to file with the county, how to make liens appear legitimate, and what language to use in demand letters to maximize confusion and fear. She'd even created a fake website for the Alpine Valley Property Management Association, complete with testimonials and official-looking policies. Vincent handled the intimidation tactics. He would show up at properties claiming to be conducting compliance inspections, taking photos and pointing out supposed violations that justified additional fees. He had a commanding presence and an authoritative manner that convinced many property owners he was legitimate. But Vincent had made a crucial mistake with Sarah's case. He'd underestimated his target. Unlike the elderly, isolated property owners they usually victimized, Sarah was young, tech-savvy, and had grown up hearing her grandfather's stories about dealing with various scammers and con artists over the years. Sarah's first red flag came when she tried to find more information about the Alpine Valley Property Management Association online. While their website looked professional, a reverse image search revealed that most of their photos were stock images stolen from other real estate sites. The testimonials featured names that didn't correspond to any real people she could find on social media or public records. Her second warning sign came when she visited the county assessor's office to review her property records. The clerk, an elderly woman named Betty who had worked there for 30 years, looked puzzled when Sarah asked about the property association. "Honey, I've never heard of any Alpine Valley Property Management Association," Betty said, pulling up Sarah's file on her computer. "Your grandfather's property has always been independent. No HOA, no management company, no special assessments." Betty's computer showed a lien filed just 2 months earlier, right after Harold's death. "This is odd," Betty muttered. "Usually we see a paper trail leading up to liens like this: violation notices, unpaid bills, board meeting minutes. This one just appeared out of nowhere." Sarah asked for copies of everything in the file, and Betty obliged. As Sarah reviewed the documents, she noticed several inconsistencies. The signature on the lien document didn't match samples of her grandfather's signature from other paperwork. The dates on some forms didn't align properly. Most suspicious of all, the lien claimed Harold had agreed to join the property association in 2018, but Sarah had copies of letters Harold had written that same year specifically declining to join various mountain community associations. Armed with growing suspicions about the legitimacy of the Alpine Valley Property Management Association, Sarah decided to visit the address listed on their correspondence. According to the letterhead, their office was located in a business complex in nearby Glenwood Springs. The address turned out to be a mailboxes, etc. Location: just a postal box service with no actual office space. The teenage clerk behind the counter confirmed that the Alpine Valley Property Management Association had rented a mailbox there for about 6 months, but she'd never seen anyone pick up mail except for a middle-aged woman with dark hair. Sarah's next stop was the phone number on the demand letter. Using a different phone and disguising her voice, she called pretending to be a potential client interested in property management services. Margaret answered again, but this time she seemed caught off guard by questions about the company's history and services. When Sarah asked for references from other property owners they'd helped, Margaret became evasive. She claimed client confidentiality prevented her from sharing specific names, but she could provide general testimonials. When pressed for the company's business license number and insurance information, Margaret said she'd have to call back with those details, a call that never came. Sarah realized she was definitely dealing with a scam, but she wasn't sure how to prove it or protect herself legally. The fraudulent lien was already on record with the county, which meant it could potentially prevent her from selling or refinancing the property until it was resolved. That's when Sarah decided to contact David Kim, the property attorney whose name she'd found while researching real estate fraud cases online. David specialized in exactly these types of scams and had successfully defended dozens of property owners against fraudulent liens and fake associations. During their first meeting, David reviewed all of Sarah's documentation with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen this type of fraud before. "This is definitely a scam," he confirmed. "The good news is that we can prove it. The bad news is that these people are probably going to escalate their harassment once they realize you're not going to pay." David's prediction proved accurate. Within days of Sarah hiring him, she received a new letter from Margaret claiming that the debt had grown to $52,000 due to additional legal fees and collection costs. The letter also stated that the property association was prepared to begin foreclosure proceedings immediately. But the harassment didn't stop with letters. Vincent began showing up at the cabin, claiming he needed to conduct mandatory property inspections to assess damage and code violations. He would arrive unannounced, take photos of the exterior, and leave official-looking violation notices attached to the door. Sarah felt increasingly unsafe visiting her own property. Vincent was a large, intimidating man who seemed to take pleasure in making property owners feel powerless. He would stand too close when talking, raise his voice if questioned, and make veiled threats about serious legal consequences for non-compliance. The violation notices were works of fiction, claiming problems like unauthorized modifications to original structure for improvements that Harold had made decades earlier, and environmental violations for the natural stream that ran through the property. Each notice came with additional fees and penalties that further inflated the supposed debt. David Kim had dealt with Vincent Rothschild before and knew exactly what they were facing. While Sarah thought she was dealing with simple harassment, David recognized this as part of a larger criminal conspiracy that had been operating for years. David's strategy was to build an airtight case proving the fraudulent nature of the Alpine Valley Property Management Association while simultaneously protecting Sarah's property from any legitimate-seeming legal action. He started by requesting all documentation related to the association's formation, its board of directors, and its legal authority to assess fees against Sarah's property. When Margaret failed to provide adequate documentation within the legal deadline, David filed a motion to have the fraudulent lien removed from Sarah's property records. He also requested a full investigation into the association's business practices and financial records. But David's most clever move was setting up a sting operation to catch Vincent and Margaret in the act of fraud. Working with Detective Ray Holbrook, who had been investigating Vincent's activities for months, David arranged for an undercover officer to pose as an elderly property owner who had recently inherited mountain land. The undercover operation was a complete success. Vincent and Margaret followed their standard playbook perfectly, filing a fraudulent lien, sending threatening demand letters, and showing up to intimidate the property owner into compliance. This time, however, every interaction was recorded and documented by law enforcement. Detective Holbrook arrested Vincent and Margaret on charges of real estate fraud, filing false documents, and criminal conspiracy. The investigation revealed that their scheme had defrauded at least 12 property owners out of a combined total of over $3.2 million. But Sarah's ordeal wasn't over yet. Even with Vincent and Margaret in custody, the fraudulent lien remained on her property records, and she discovered that Vincent had taken one final, desperate action before his arrest. He had forged documents claiming that the Alpine Valley Property Management Association was seizing the cabin for unpaid debts and had actually listed the property for sale with a local real estate agency. Sarah learned about the unauthorized sale when a real estate agent called her, claiming to represent potential buyers who wanted to tour the cabin. The agent was shocked to learn that Sarah was the actual owner and had never authorized any sale. Racing to the cabin, Sarah found a "for sale" sign planted in her front yard and a lockbox attached to her door. Vincent had somehow obtained keys to the property and was preparing to show it to buyers, planning to pocket the proceeds from a sale he had no authority to conduct. Sarah's discovery of the unauthorized sale attempt marked the beginning of the most dramatic phase of her battle to protect her property. Vincent might have been under arrest, but his criminal enterprise had momentum of its own. Fake documents were still circulating, the fraudulent lien remained active, and the real estate listing was generating genuine buyer interest. David Kim immediately filed emergency motions to halt the unauthorized sale and remove all fraudulent documentation from public records. But the legal system moved slowly, and Sarah realized she needed to take immediate action to protect her cabin while the courts sorted out the paperwork. Working with Detective Holbrook, Sarah decided on a bold strategy. She would secure the cabin herself and document everything to build an even stronger case against Vincent's criminal organization. This meant changing all the locks, installing security cameras, and essentially turning the property into a fortress against further intrusion. Sarah spent an entire weekend at the cabin with a locksmith, replacing every lock on the property and installing a comprehensive security system. She also hired a private investigator to document all of Vincent's fraudulent activities and track down other properties he had targeted. The private investigator, a former FBI agent named Tom Crawford, uncovered a treasure trove of evidence. Vincent's scheme was even more extensive than anyone had realized. He had created multiple fake property management companies, filed fraudulent liens against dozens of properties, and had been operating the scam across 3 different Colorado counties. Tom's investigation also revealed that Vincent had been working with corrupt officials in certain county offices, paying bribes to have his fraudulent documents processed without proper scrutiny. This discovery expanded the case from simple real estate fraud to a much larger corruption investigation involving multiple government employees. But Vincent wasn't going down without a fight. Even from jail, he managed to orchestrate continued harassment of Sarah through associates who weren't yet under investigation. She received threatening phone calls, found her cabin's windows broken on multiple occasions, and discovered that someone had been attempting to break into the property at night. The turning point came when Sarah's new security cameras captured Vincent's business partner, a man named Rick Santos, attempting to break into the cabin with a crowbar. Rick had been trying to retrieve documents that Vincent had hidden in the cabin's basement, evidence that could implicate even more people in the conspiracy. Detective Holbrook used the break-in attempt to obtain search warrants for all of Vincent's properties and business associates. The raids uncovered boxes of forged documents, computer files detailing the entire fraud operation, and financial records showing exactly how much money had been stolen from legitimate property owners. The evidence was overwhelming. Vincent's organization had been operating for over 5 years, targeting inherited mountain properties throughout Colorado. They had stolen millions of dollars through fraudulent liens, forced sales, and intimidation tactics. Sarah's case had been their downfall because she had fought back instead of capitulating like their previous victims. The final confrontation came not in a courtroom, but on Sarah's own property. Vincent had somehow made bail and decided on one last desperate attempt to seize the cabin. He arrived with 2 associates and a moving truck, claiming he had a court order authorizing him to take possession of the property for unpaid debts. Sarah was alone at the cabin when Vincent arrived, but she wasn't defenseless. Her security system immediately alerted both the police and her attorney, and she had prepared for exactly this scenario. From inside the cabin, she live-streamed the entire confrontation on social media while calmly explaining to Vincent that he was trespassing on private property. Vincent's associates seemed nervous about the situation, especially when Sarah announced that everything was being recorded and broadcast live. But Vincent himself was beyond rational thought. He had invested too much time and money in stealing this property to give up now. "This cabin is mine," Vincent shouted at the security cameras. "That old man agreed to pay fees to my association, and now I'm collecting what's owed." Sarah's response was calm but firm. "Vincent, you're trespassing on my property. I own this cabin free and clear. Your fake association has no legal authority here. The police are on their way." Vincent began directing his associates to start loading cabin furnishings into their truck, apparently believing that possession would somehow legitimize his claims. But his associates refused, recognizing that they were being asked to commit obvious crimes on camera. When Vincent tried to force his way into the cabin, Sarah was ready. She had reinforced the doors and windows, and Vincent found himself locked out of the property he was trying to steal. His frustrated attempts to break in were captured in high definition by Sarah's security cameras. Detective Holbrook arrived with backup just as Vincent was attempting to break down the cabin's front door with a crowbar. The sight of multiple police vehicles racing up the mountain road finally convinced Vincent's associates to abandon him completely. Vincent's arrest was dramatic and definitive. He was charged with attempted breaking and entering, criminal trespass, violation of bail conditions, and multiple counts related to his ongoing fraud conspiracy. This time there would be no bail. With Vincent finally behind bars and his criminal organization dismantled, Sarah was able to begin repairing the damage to her property and her life. The fraudulent lien was officially removed from county records, and all of Vincent's fake documentation was expunged from public files. But Sarah's victory extended far beyond her own case. Detective Holbrook's investigation had uncovered evidence that led to the arrest of 6 other people involved in the real estate fraud conspiracy, including 2 county officials who had been accepting bribes to process fraudulent documents. The scheme had affected 23 different properties across 3 counties, with total damages exceeding $4.2 million. Sarah's willingness to fight back and document everything had provided the evidence needed to shut down the entire operation and recover money for other victims. David Kim filed a successful civil lawsuit against Vincent and his associates, securing a judgment that would compensate Sarah for her legal fees, property damage, and emotional distress. While Vincent would likely never be able to pay the full amount, his assets were seized and distributed among his victims. The real estate agent who had unknowingly listed Sarah's cabin was horrified to learn she'd been manipulated by criminals. She provided additional evidence against Vincent and helped Sarah understand how the unauthorized listing had been created using forged documents. Sarah decided to keep the cabin and turn it into a memorial to her grandfather's memory. She renovated the property using insurance money from the damage Vincent's people had caused, updating the electrical and plumbing systems while preserving the rustic character that Harold had created. The renovation became a labor of love, with Sarah learning carpentry and other skills her grandfather had tried to teach her during childhood summers. She found therapy in the physical work and satisfaction in restoring the cabin to better condition than it had ever been in. Local media covered Sarah's story extensively, turning her into something of a folk hero for property owners facing similar harassment. She received letters from people across the country who had dealt with fraudulent liens and fake property associations. Sarah used her newfound platform to educate other property owners about real estate fraud and the warning signs of scam operations. She worked with Detective Holbrook to create educational materials that helped people recognize and report suspicious property management claims. Vincent Rothschild was ultimately sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for his role in the real estate fraud conspiracy. Margaret Chen received 5 years, and their various associates received sentences ranging from probation to 3 years depending on their level of involvement. The 2 corrupt county officials lost their jobs and faced criminal charges of their own. The investigation led to systemic reforms in how property liens are processed and verified, making it much harder for fraudulent documents to be accepted without proper scrutiny. Sarah's cabin became a symbol of resistance against property theft and fraud. She established a small nonprofit organization dedicated to helping other victims of real estate scams, using her experience to guide people through the complex process of fighting fraudulent liens and fake associations. Detective Holbrook was promoted and became the head of a new real estate fraud task force that investigated suspicious property transactions throughout Colorado. He credited Sarah's case with teaching him the importance of taking property owner complaints seriously, even when the alleged fraud seemed sophisticated or well documented. David Kim expanded his practice to focus exclusively on real estate fraud cases, using the publicity from Sarah's victory to attract other clients who needed help fighting property scams. He developed a reputation as the go-to attorney for people facing fraudulent liens and fake HOA claims. The cabin itself became a gathering place for Sarah's extended family and friends. She hosted regular summer barbecues and winter skiing trips, sharing the property her grandfather had loved with a new generation of mountain enthusiasts. Sarah kept Harold's workshop exactly as he had left it, complete with his handmade tools and half-finished woodworking projects. She found peace in the familiar smell of sawdust and oil, and sometimes felt her grandfather's presence most strongly when she was working on cabin maintenance projects. The deeper lesson of Sarah's ordeal reaches far beyond real estate fraud into fundamental questions about how we protect what matters most to us. Her story demonstrates that criminals often succeed not because their schemes are particularly clever, but because their victims feel overwhelmed and alone when facing complex legal harassment. Sarah's victory came from her refusal to be intimidated by official-looking documents and authoritative-sounding demands. By questioning everything, researching thoroughly, and seeking professional help when needed, she was able to expose a fraud that had been operating successfully for years. The case also highlights the importance of proper documentation and record-keeping. Harold Mitchell's meticulous financial records provided crucial evidence that the Alpine Valley Property Management Association's claims were false. Without those records, Sarah might have found it much harder to prove that her grandfather had never agreed to any association membership. Sarah's use of technology, security cameras, social media streaming, and digital documentation turned Vincent's final confrontation into his definitive downfall. By making his criminal behavior public and impossible to deny, she removed any ambiguity about who was the victim and who was the perpetrator. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah's story shows that fighting back against fraud and harassment can protect not just yourself, but countless other potential victims. Her willingness to pursue the case aggressively led to the exposure of a much larger criminal conspiracy that had victimized dozens of families. The fake property association scam that targeted Sarah continues to evolve and spread to new areas, but her case established legal precedents and investigation techniques that make it easier for law enforcement to recognize and prosecute these crimes. Today, Sarah Mitchell splits her time between her Denver design business and her grandfather's mountain cabin, which has become both a personal retreat and a symbol of successful resistance against property theft. The cabin sits securely on its 5 acres of pristine Colorado wilderness, protected by both the law and Sarah's unwavering determination to preserve her family's legacy. And somewhere in the federal correctional system, Vincent Rothschild has plenty of time to reflect on what happens when you try to steal from someone who refuses to be intimidated. His attempt to put Sarah's cabin up for sale ended with him locked away instead, a fitting conclusion to a scheme that ultimately destroyed its architect while failing to claim even a single acre of the land he coveted.